The snow arrived before dawn and stayed as if it had nowhere else to go, settling into the grooves of the street and the tired shoulders of the town. Wooden buildings hunched beneath its weight, their windows clouded with frost and memory. At the edge of the main road stood a narrow shop with a hand-painted sign that read Calloway Repairs, its letters faded by years of sun and patience. Abigail Calloway unlocked the door as she did every morning, her breath rising in pale ghosts, her gloves stiff with cold and habit. She was 50 years old, though the number mattered less than the feeling of it, the way time had pressed itself into her bones. Her hands were strong, scarred from needles, nails, and honest work. Her hair, once dark as wet earth, had softened into silver strands she no longer bothered to hide. The town knew her as dependable, quiet, and finished in the way people assumed certain lives were finished once youth had gone missing. Inside the shop, the air smelled of oil, wool, and old wood. Shelves held broken things waiting for mercy, boots with worn soles, coats with torn linings, watches that had forgotten how to keep time. Abigail lit the stove and listened to it crackle awake. The sound was familiar, comforting, like a voice that had never left her. She moved through the space with practiced ease, hanging her coat, setting her tools in order, preparing for customers who might or might not come. There had been a time when she prepared herself differently. Back then, she had smoothed her hair before opening the door, chosen dresses that suggested softness rather than endurance. Silas Crowder had noticed those things. He had been a man who spoke easily and smiled often, a merchant with ambitions that stretched beyond the town and beyond her. He had liked her company when it made him feel generous, when her laughter filled the silences he feared. When winter crept into her hair and lines gathered at her eyes, his visits grew thin, then stopped altogether. He left with a polite apology and a promise that never returned. Abigail did not curse him. She had learned that bitterness only deepened the cold. Instead, she folded the memory away like a letter that no longer needed reading. Still, it shaped her. It taught her how affection could be offered and withdrawn without warning, how love could be made to feel conditional, fragile as ice over moving water. By the time she reached 50, she stopped waiting for something that had proven unreliable. The town watched her with a kind of gentle dismissal. Mrs. Peck from 2 doors down nodded kindly but never lingered. The young delivery boy, Thomas Reed, greeted her with the careless cheer of someone who could not imagine her having once been young. Even Sheriff Amos Blackwood, who respected her work and her silence, spoke to her as one speaks to a fixture rather than a woman with unfinished chapters. That morning the storm thickened, the snow falling heavier, the sky a low, unbroken gray. Abigail stood at the window and watched the street disappear inch by inch. She thought of her sister Rose, gone these 10 years, who had once told her that hearts were stubborn things and could surprise you long after you stopped asking them to. Abigail had smiled then, indulgent, unconvinced. Rose had always believed in late miracles. Abigail believed in what could be repaired and what could not. She returned to her work, mending a torn coat with careful stitches. Each pull of thread was deliberate, steady. Outside, the wind pressed against the door, testing it. She felt no sense of anticipation, only routine. Love, she believed, belonged to younger women and braver men. It was a language she no longer spoke, a fire she had learned to live without. Yet beneath that certainty lived something quieter, a fatigue she rarely named. There were evenings when the shop closed early and the dark arrived too soon, when the silence pressed harder than the cold. She filled those hours with small tasks, sweeping floors already clean, counting buttons, rearranging shelves that never stayed arranged. These acts gave shape to time, kept it from stretching into longing. The town itself seemed to conspire with her resolve. Windows glowed briefly at supper, then dimmed. Laughter passed her door and moved on. Snow erased footprints almost as soon as they were made, leaving no record of who had walked beside whom. Abigail told herself this was freedom, that solitude asked nothing of her and took nothing away. She repeated it until the words felt smooth, like stones worn down by water. When the bell above the door rang late that morning, its sound cut cleanly through the quiet. Abigail looked up, expecting Thomas or perhaps no one at all, the bell stirred by wind. Instead, a tall figure stood framed by white light, snow clinging to his coat, his presence solid and unhurried. He did not step forward at once, as if sensing the gravity of entering a life long settled. Abigail met his gaze, steady, unreadable, unaware that the winter she had accepted without complaint was about to test her certainty in ways she could not yet imagine. In that pause, with snow whispering down and the stove ticking behind her, Abigail felt a faint disturbance, not hope, not fear, but recognition of change. She did not welcome it. She had learned how to live without expecting anything new. Still, something old and dormant stirred, like ground shifting beneath frost. The man brushed snow from his hat, respectful, patient, waiting to be acknowledged. Outside, the storm continued its quiet work, sealing roads, closing distances, binding the town inward. Whatever had just arrived with him would not leave quickly, and the season ahead promised to ask more of her than endurance alone. She stood there breathing, unaware this moment marked the true beginning of everything. Jedediah Holt stepped fully inside only after Abigail inclined her head, as if permission mattered to him. He closed the door with care, shutting out the wind without slamming it, and the bell above gave a muted ring that settled slowly. Snow melted from his coat and darkened the floorboards beneath his boots. He removed his hat and held it at his side, revealing hair touched by gray and a face weathered by long days rather than hard choices. He did not look around the shop at first. He looked at her, not with hunger or judgment, but with the quiet attention of a man accustomed to listening to land in silence. Abigail gestured toward the counter without speaking. He approached and placed a pair of leather gloves down gently, as though setting something living to rest. One finger was split at the seam, the stitching worn thin by years of rains and cold mornings. He explained what needed mending in a voice low and even, the words unadorned. She listened, nodding, her hands already understanding the work before her mind caught up. When she quoted the price, he accepted it without pause, as if fairness were expected rather than negotiated. While she worked, the shop settled into a shared quiet. Jedediah did not pace or hover. He stood near the stove, warming his hands, his gaze resting on nothing in particular. Abigail noticed how he filled the space without taking it over. There was no performance in him, no restless need to be seen. When he spoke again, it was to comment on the storm, the way it had come early and hard this year. She agreed, offering little more. Silence returned, companionable, unforced. She finished the gloves and handed them back. His fingers brushed hers briefly, a contact so ordinary it startled her by its absence of intention. He thanked her, his gratitude plain, and lingered only long enough to ask when she closed. When she told him, he nodded and said he might return before then, should the roads worsen. It sounded practical, not hopeful. He left the shop as carefully as he had entered, pulling his hat low against the snow. He returned 2 days later, then again the next week. Sometimes he brought something to mend, sometimes only the excuse of checking the weather. Abigail learned his name without ceremony, learned he ran cattle north of town, that he came in rarely, that he had been widowed 8 winters past. He did not speak of it as a wound still bleeding, but as a fact shaped into him, like a healed bone that remembered the break. She did not offer sympathy. She offered presence, which seemed to be what he respected. The town noticed. Mrs. Peck lingered longer when she passed, pretending interest in buttons she did not need. Thomas Reed began to grin when Jedediah was inside, sensing something quietly important without understanding it. Sheriff Blackwood tipped his hat to the rancher with approval that had nothing to do with law. Abigail felt these observations brush against her life like snowflakes, cool, fleeting, easily dismissed. Yet something in her shifted. She found herself anticipating the bell without wanting to. She straightened shelves she had left crooked for years. She listened more carefully to her own laughter when it surprised her, softer now, less guarded. Jedediah never commented on these changes. He never hurried her words or filled pauses meant to be felt. When she spoke of her sister, of the shop, of the long years she had spent repairing what others abandoned, he listened as though each detail mattered. One afternoon, as the storm thickened again, he helped her close early. They stood outside beneath the awning, snow drifting down, the world narrowed to white and breath. He spoke of his ranch, of mornings when the frost painted the fences silver, of evenings spent alone with the sound of animals settling. There was no invitation in his voice, only truth. Abigail found herself answering in kind, admitting how the quiet sometimes pressed too hard, how she had mistaken endurance for contentment. When they parted, there was no promise exchanged, no touch to seal anything. Jedediah simply said he would see her soon if the weather allowed. As she watched him walk away, steady against the wind, Abigail felt something unfamiliar take shape. Not longing, not fear, but the slow recognition that some people arrive without demanding entry, and in doing so, change the shape of a life already believed complete. The snow began to soften as February leaned toward its end, no longer sharp but heavy, falling as if tired of its own persistence. Abigail noticed it first in the way sound carried differently, how footsteps lingered instead of vanishing, how the world felt less sealed. Inside her shop, the stove burned steadier, and she found herself opening the door a little earlier, closing it a little later, as though daylight were something she had forgotten how to use. Jedediah came often now, never on a schedule, never with explanation. Sometimes he brought a cracked saddle strap or a torn coat sleeve, sometimes nothing at all. He spoke of the land cautiously, as if words were seeds that required care. She spoke of the shop, of the years it had survived drought and fire and loss, of how she had shaped herself around its needs. In these exchanges, something unspoken grew, not loud enough to frighten them, but persistent enough to be felt. Abigail struggled against it in her quieter moments. She reminded herself of Silas Crowder and the way hope had thinned her dignity. She reminded herself of her age, of how the town measured women like her. Yet Jedediah never asked her to be anything other than present. He never praised her strength as if it were novelty, never treated her solitude as something to rescue. In his company she felt neither invisible nor displayed, and the balance unsettled her. One afternoon Silas returned to town, his coat finer, his smile practiced. He stopped by the shop out of curiosity more than intention, his gaze sliding over Abigail as though assessing an old investment. He spoke kindly enough, hinting at regret at roads not taken. Abigail listened, polite, composed, aware of Jedediah's absence like a held breath. When Silas suggested supper, framing it as generosity, she felt the truth of the moment settle. She declined without apology, watching surprise flicker and fade from his face. When he left, the door closing sharply behind him, Abigail felt no triumph, only clarity. That evening she walked with Jedediah through the town's quiet streets. Snow fell lightly, the sky wide and pale. He spoke then of his wife, of how grief had taught him patience, how rushing love once had nearly broken him. Abigail told him she had stopped believing in timing altogether, had decided some seasons simply ended. They walked on, their steps measured, their words careful. When they stopped, their hands brushed and neither pulled away. The contact held, gentle, certain enough. In the days that followed, the town shifted subtly. Mrs. Peck smiled openly now. Thomas Reed delivered parcels with conspiratorial delight. Sheriff Blackwood nodded, satisfied. Abigail felt the change most acutely in herself. She slept deeper, woke lighter. The shop felt less like refuge and more like foundation. Yet she feared naming what had begun. Naming things had a way of inviting loss. The storm returned without warning, fierce and loud, trapping Jedediah in town overnight. Abigail opened the shop as shelter, the stove glowing, neighbors gathering. Jedediah stayed close, wordless support in every motion. When the wind finally eased and the world lay hushed and white, they stood alone amid the warmth and quiet. Jedediah spoke then not of love but of choice, of staying because staying mattered. Abigail listened, heart steady, realizing winter had not ended, but something beneath it had begun to thaw, and it would not return to what it had been. The storm returned at dusk, sudden and merciless, folding the town into white silence. Snow struck the windows like handfuls of thrown grain, relentless and loud. Abigail barred the shop door as wind clawed at the hinges, knowing no one else would come. The decision felt final and necessary, the kind made without ceremony. When she turned, Jedediah stood behind her, coat powdered with snow, eyes steady. He had stayed because leaving had ceased to make sense. The town slept under the storm, but the shop held warmth and breath and waiting. Neighbors had drifted in earlier seeking shelter, then drifted out again trusting what remained. Now only the two of them stood within the circle of lamplight. Jedediah removed his gloves slowly as if time itself required respect. Abigail felt the old instinct to retreat, to name distance as safety. She did not obey it. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing denied entry. Jedediah spoke then not of love but of staying through the night and the storm. He said it plainly, offering his presence as fact rather than plea. Abigail nodded, surprised by the calm that filled her chest. They moved together without touching, sharing tasks learned through long solitude. When the stove dimmed, Jedediah fed it wood, his movements careful and sure. Abigail watched him and understood what steadiness truly meant. Hours passed, measured not by clocks but by breath and shared silence. At last, Jedediah faced her fully, snow melting from his shoulders. He told her he had lived long enough without hope and without despair. He said choosing her felt neither reckless nor late. Abigail felt tears rise, not from longing but from recognition. She had been seen, fully and without revision. The storm broke sometime before dawn, leaving the world hushed and new. Light crept through the windows, pale and forgiving. Jedediah stood beside her as the town woke again. He did not ask her to leave the shop or the life she had built. He asked only to walk alongside it. Abigail agreed with a quiet certainty that surprised them both. Days followed with purpose. Jedediah began dividing his time between ranch and town, not abandoning one life for another but weaving them together. Abigail felt the town respond, doors opening, voices warmer, respect deepening. Silas Crowder passed through once more and found no opening, no shadow of doubt to exploit. He tipped his hat and moved on, already forgotten. Mrs. Peck brought bread without pretense. Thomas Reed watched with awe, learning that endings could reverse themselves. Spring crept closer, hinted at in softened mornings and longer light. Abigail discovered joy in anticipation rather than defense. Jedediah remained constant, never promising more than he intended to give, giving more than he ever promised. Together they learned a rhythm built from choice, not need. Love did not arrive as rescue or reward. It arrived as recognition, as home found late and welcomed without shame. On the morning the snow finally began to melt in earnest, Abigail opened the shop door and did not feel alone. She felt accompanied, witnessed, firmly rooted in the present. Jedediah stood with her, hat in hand, ready for work and weather alike. Life stretched ahead, not unbroken but shared. Winter had taught her patience. Love had taught her timing. And if you have listened to this tale and felt something stir, carry it with you. Like the story, share your thoughts, leave a comment and subscribe for more quiet fireside truths. Tell us where you are watching from and whether winter has ever surprised you too.